Alright, so in this video we're just going to texture the ball and put some lights around the ball and texture this plane down here. So before we begin, click off only render so we can see the elements in our scene like our light, and we'll put on this 3D manipulator down here. Okay, and if we scroll to the back we have our bouncing ball again. So by default, your render is set to Blender render, which doesn't look as good. Just keep it for cycles. We'll work with Blender render later. And over here, you can go to your rendered setting. I like the shortcut Shift-Z. And we don't need to render all this stuff. So in your render settings, hit border. So now the computer isn't working to render everything. Okay, so let's bring the ball down. So if we zoom into the ball, just middle mouse wheel, holding shift and middle mouse click, so let's bring it up to there and split the view so we can see our ball. And I'm going to go to the node editor over here and close these properties. Let me turn on my screencast. Okay, not that it won't really work when I'm using the node editor. So when we make a material, there's a really useful add-on in user preferences. Click add-ons and type on node. And it's called the node wrangler. So click that little checkbox and save user settings because we'll always use it. We want to do the material of the ball, so make sure the ball is selected. You can click the materials over here, but we're also down here, so it'll kind of duplicate information. But click new material. And let's go to rendered, Shift-Z, or you can choose it over here. So that's our diffuse. You could change the color if you want, and we could leave it like that. Let's see it squash. Yeah. But what we want is not the diffuse. So I'm going to choose that node. We have our material output there by default, but Shift-A to add a new shader. We're going to look for principled. And principled is just going to give it a diffuse. It's like combining a diffuse and glossy. You can see a little bit more of a shine there. If we go to preview, let's change the color to like dark red, and you can darken the red too. You see a little shine. The only values we care about now are the color, the roughness, and the normal. If you drag this roughness down, you can see over on the right side, that's what if you had a reflective background, it's super reflective, almost wet. You pump it up to 1, it's so rough, it's like a diffuse. But 0 to 1, if you drag that slider, it could also be visualized as black to white. So if we were to plug an image texture into this little socket right here that had varying black and white, it'll give it some more interesting variation. So let's do that. So we could use the node. I have this texture. We could use the node wrangler right now to speed it up, but let me just show you how you do it manually first. So I just drug the texture in. I'm plugging it into there, and we don't see anything yet because we need a mapping node, which is in vector, and then we need a texture coordinate node, which is in input. But let's just search for mapping. And then let's search for texture coordinate, which is in the input, but we'll just, and by default it goes to the UV. A UV just means you have the vertices. You're basically telling, the vertices where you want them on the texture, but we haven't done that. So you can skip that step by just saying generated. So we'll plug the generated in, and now we're seeing our texture like stretched across the ball. If we want to see it without the shading, if you hit Control Shift and click on your texture, then we get to see the texture with no shading, and that's kind of what we want because it speeds up your render a little bit so you can make changes. So first let's fix the texture. Right now we have a flat texture being stretched across a sphere. So if we switch to sphere, it gives us a much better result, but the problem is it's like a square, being stretched across a sphere. So let's switch to, I think for this situation, box will be better. And you can see the seams as if this were like a rounded out cube. You know, here's the top of the cube, here's the front, here's the side. But we can blend that seam so it's not as apparent. It doesn't look that great. But if we switch the scale of our texture, so like imagine basically it's as if the ball will get bigger, so in relation the circles look smaller. To do that, we'll make the scale like 3. So if you just click on the X and drag down quickly, you have all those values selected. And now hit 3. And now we have all these tiny little balls that look like that when we have it pumped through the principled shader. I'm just hitting Control-Shift-Click to plug it back in, but you could also drag that noodle. So one of the common nodes we use in shading is if you go to color, you can do an RGB curves, and let's darken our texture a bit by drag. This is C. I'm not sure what it stands for, but this is the lightness of the texture. Let's Control-Shift-Click to see it without shading. So we'll darken it, and I want a red ball, so I'm going to bring up the red by dragging up. And there was originally some green in it, so let's drop the green down and maybe drop the blue down. And that looks pretty good to me. So that's what it looks like once it's being shaded. But there's just this smooth reflection on it right now, as if there's no texture to that ball. We want to add texture, so I'm going to hide this a little bit, and we'll use this texture again, but I'm going to duplicate it with Shift-D, and I'm going to drag this vector, which basically tells you know, how we want it placed, and Control-Shift-Click. So we don't care about the color so much anymore. We just care about the values from black to white. So let's switch this to non-color data, and it's not quite black to white yet. And let's go to Converter, Color Ramp. This is another node you use. This is like my most used node when I'm making materials. So it put it to black and white. The black meaning totally smooth, the white meaning totally rough. And if you add a new point, you know, you can really, I mean, you could even color your textures like this, but we want the black to be on the edges of those circles. So I'm going to flip these and bring that down. So it's more of like a gray, and we don't ever want it totally smooth. So let's bring the value of the white down. So it's always a little, I mean, we don't want it totally rough. So let's bring it down to like black, closer to black. And we don't ever want it totally smooth like glass. So let's bring that up a bit. And let's pump that into the roughness value and pump our principled into the surface. So now we see some variation of roughness, but let's give it some depth now. And we can't just plug this into the normal. We need to like explain how we want this to be read. Go to vector, we're gonna add a bump. And we're gonna add another color ramp. So converter, color ramp. We'll plug this in. The whites, the light parts means it'll have the highest depth. The blacks means it'll be like a crevice kind of. So if we plug the color into the height, not the normal, you can see there's like, it looks like it has a texture, but we don't want that much. So I'm going to change this to like 0.2 and then plug this into the normal. And now it looks like we have some depth, but it looks way too wet still. So let's go back here and just lighten everything a bit. And lighten this. Maybe we do want it full. There. So now we have kind of a smooth, it still looks a little wet to me, but like a bouncy ball with some detail in it. So for the next video, I decided not to put it all in one, but for the next video we will change the lighting, we'll make it a dark world, and we'll texture this ground and do some basic modeling to give it like a curb. Okay.